You know, the only thing more confusing to me than the history and timeline of Teyvat is its prehistory, or rather, pre-human history. Because there was a time when humans weren't around, you know. Before Enkanomiya, we really only had a couple of vague references to Teyvat's prehistory in various fictional books. We'd never had a proper legend or historical record to reference before, so getting the book Before Sun and Moon really changed things. This book contains highlights and passages from prehistoric times, as well as Enkanomiya's more modern-ish times. And honestly, it really does change the game for us, literally. Now, I've already talked about all of the normal historical elements and how it relates to Enkanomiya in another video, which I will leave a link to in the description. So in this video, we'll have a quick recap about the contents of the notorious book that got Orobashi killed, learn a little bit more about the real-world inspirations for the characters within it, and do a little bit of theorizing at the end. So sit down, grab a snack, and get ready because this is Teyvat's Prehistory, an in-depth look at the times before the sun and moons. Now, before we begin, let me remind you again, the lore we have is rather sparse, so a good chunk of this video will be pure speculation. Please don't take everything here as 100% factual information as per canon timelines and such, because while I do my best to make sure I am providing as accurate information as possible, I am not infallible and I am going to be filling in a lot of these blank areas with assumptions and opinions. So always make sure to check the pinned comment below because that's where I will be posting corrections to these speculations and assumptions and any additional updates to the video's content. For further reading and cited sources, those will be in the description box. Now, if you have not read the book Before Sun and Moon, I highly suggest that you take the time right now to do so. It's not very long, it's just the one book, and you kind of only really need to read half of it. It should take you like all of 5 minutes. There is a link to this in the description, but for those of you who do not want to read the book for whatever reason, just prepare yourself to lack a little bit of preliminary context and be a little bit confused. Okay? Alright then, that's enough of that. On to the stuff that is actually interesting! The book Before Sun and Moon starts with the passage labeled When Doves Held Branches, which is a really curious choice for a title outlining the Genesis story for your planet. Why? Well, if you're at all familiar with the tale of Noah's Ark, then you may remember that after the world was destroyed by a flood, Noah released doves from his ship to see if the flood waters had started to recede. If a dove returned with a branch in its beak, which it did, it returned with an olive branch, then Noah would know that there was habitable land nearby and that they could finally get off this boat and go back to land like normal people and all of the animals that happen to be on this gigantic boat. Naming your Genesis story after a dove that located habitable land on an already pre-existing world that had been destroyed by a cataclysm is just weird. And that's why I think this passage implies the land wasn't necessarily being created, but located. It establishes that the world already existed before the arrival of the Primordial One, who was supposed to be like the creator of everything. Which means that this also isn't technically a Genesis story, even though it's being portrayed that way. We're going to ignore that little detail for now. Moving on. The next line reads, When the eternal throne of heavens came, the world was made anew. Then the true Lord, the Primordial One, came forth and did battle against the 7 terrifying sovereigns, dragon lords of the old world. We know from the context of later lines in this book that the Eternal Throne is likely referencing the Primordial One, but note the order of events here because it's really particular about them, even in the Chinese version. First the throne arrived, and then the world was remade. And then the Primordial One fought the Dragon Kings. There's a very particular order of events. This strengthens the idea that the world had already existed and been destroyed, and probably was not habitable when the Eternal Throne or the Primordial One arrived. And then it had to be remade anew, or like cleansed, purged, or altered in some way. Like you gotta clean up the mess you made, right? Like if you flooded the earth and you gotta take all the water and put it somewhere so that people... Anyway. The point is that the planet already existed, and the Primordial One was just making adjustments to what was already there. It didn't technically create anything. Not yet, anyway. Now, sometime between the remaking of the world and the battle between the Primordial One and the dragons that follow, the Bishop race would have not only come into being, but would have had to dominate the existing world. Either that, or they just survived the working of the world. That could also be a thing. I mean, technically speaking, if the world was wiped out once and then became habitable again after a long period of time, it's possible that evolution just kind of rebooted, and that bishops are nothing more than fancy magic dinosaurs. I will revisit this concept in another video. I just think it's funny that, we go around in Enkanomiya beating up dinosaurs. I like it. So, in order to do battle against the magic magic bishops, the Primordial One creates 4 shades of itself at this point, and also uses an eggshell to separate the universe from the world. I am only interested in the timeline of events in this section, so we'll leave this here for now, but remember this point because we're going to talk about the Primordial One and its shades in the next section. The next passage is called 40 Years After the Held Branches. I'm going to preface this whole section by saying that 40 years might not literally be 40 rotations of the Earth around the sun, because we have no way of knowing how long a time span this is actually referring to, so it's less 40 years and more like 40 time unit things. Either way, this passage's title is yet another reference to Noah's Ark. While Noah didn't spend 40 years at sea, it did rain for 40 days and 40 nights in order for the flood to do its thing where it's flooding. So 40 days after the rain began, Noah began sending out doves to find dry land. In some interpretations, like that of Abraham ibn Ezra, the Ark wasn't a normal ship, but instead a vessel that stayed underwater for 40 days before surfacing. That's quite the imagination for a 12th century poet when you realize that the first submarine was conceptualized in the 1500s and wasn't built until the 1800s. That's just nutty. Anyway, the passage continues with 40 winters entombed the flames and 40 summers churned the seas. Again, a reference to Noah's Ark. But if you watched this video of mine, this might sound familiar for another reason. An extremely long and brutal winter, followed by the world getting set on fire, followed by a flood. It's basically the description of Ragnarok, including the battle, because you've got the battle of the Primordial One versus the bishops, right? Like that counts. So this strengthens the idea that the world already existed, again, but was destroyed due to a disaster of some sort. Pre-Primordial One. And then the passage continues with, the 7 sovereigns were vanquished and the 7 nations submitted to the heavens. What's odd here about this passage is that the 7 nations apparently already existed, so the 7 sovereigns might have ruled over them. If the nations didn't exist, then there wouldn't be a need for them to submit to the heavens because they wouldn't be there. The book would have just said something like, the land submitted to the heavens, instead of specifically saying the 7 nations. What's exceptionally odd is that at this point in time, humans did not exist. They had not yet been created. So who was occupying the lands in such a way that they could be distinguished as 7 individual nations? Well, we'll mull over that idea later, I guess. Next up, we have the passage titled 400 Years After the Held Branches. Now remember, this is probably not literally 400 years, but 400 of whatever time unit primordial gods use, or completely metaphorical. Point is, this passage takes place a good while after the first passage and the arrival of the Primordial One, because like 40 years versus 400 years, it's like multiple. Anyway, I'll paraphrase a little here. This is the point at which the world was essentially terraformed in preparation for the coming of humanity. This terraformation was done by the Primordial One and precisely one of its 4 shades. Together, they also created flora, fauna, and obviously, finally, humans. But you gotta wonder, right? If the Primordial One had 4 shades, yet only one of them was used for creating basically everything, what on earth were the other 3 even doing? I guess we'll investigate that later too. Now, the last 2 passages don't really have much information in them, but their titles reference the proverbial Ark's opening. As if the references to Noah's Ark weren't obvious enough, well, here you go. The Primordial One either had or created an arc within which it placed humans. There's one more relevant passage titled The Funerary Year, which describes the arrival of another heavenly throne that then started a war that caused Enkanomiya to fall beneath the sea. The idea that another entity arrived on this planet and fought with the Primordial One appears to be a major catalyst in a series of events that set the whole game into motion. For example, the Abyss Order is particularly motivated to prove out their theories about the Second Throne, and the Second Throne might also be one of the reasons that Conria tried to fight Heaven to begin with. It's kind of a big deal, and it's only mentioned in passing, which is a little weird. We'll look into this later, in depth, promise. But for now, that's basically everything that the book Before Sun and Moon covers. So let's take a really quick recap before we move on to investigate matters further. First, the world was destroyed, then remade, and then the Bishops dominated this land. Then, the Primordial One showed up and killed the battled the Bishops. During this time, it created 4 shades of itself. The Primordial One and its shades defeat the Bishop Kings, and the world submits to the Primordial One, who then separates the Earth from the rest of the universe in preparation for the coming of humans, and this is probably more of a metaphor for the creation or opening of this arc thing that we don't really understand that well. Now, the remaining bishops flee to the Dark Sea and to the underground, while the Primordial One and the one other shade work together to create flora, fauna, and finally humans. The other 3 shades are AFK at this point. Now, sometime after civilization happens, a second heavenly throne arrives from some unknown location and starts another devastating war. The outcome of this war is unclear. You got all that? Great. Well then, let's begin our investigations by taking a closer look at this Primordial One. Okay, let's get one thing straight right off the bat. A lot of people think that the Primordial One goes by the name of Phanes, and this is because of a suggestion that's made in the book Before Sun and Moon. I am here to tell you that this is probably not the case. In the passage titled On Phanes or the Primordial One, there is a lot of uncertainty that's been specified. This section starts with the line, "The Primordial One may have been Phanes." Emphasis on the may have been, because apparently not even this historian of an author is so certain about this statement that they have made sure to mark it as questionable. So, while it is possible that Phanes is the Primordial One, it is equally possible that he is not. And I would like to proceed on the assumption that they are not the same entity for reasons that I will elaborate on in this section. Okay? Moving on. Speaking of Phanes, though, in 400 years after the held branches, we learned that the Primordial One created life with the assistance of one of its shades. I believe that the shade that assisted was in fact Phanes, and that's why the author of the book kinda lumps the two together. My reasoning comes from Orphic mythology, so let's take a quick look at that. Orphic myth, or Orphism, is a branch of Greek mythology that was considered a mystery cult and was passed down orally, so there are many variations of it. The timelines in these variations and relationships between gods vary so much between accounts that it's just a little ridiculous to parse through. Now that said, I have done what research I can, and I will be providing my personal interpretation on my findings. I'll leave links for further reading downstairs, and I do encourage you to look into it more if the topic interests you at all. Now, okay, the reason we're looking at Orphism specifically is because it's one of the only variations of Greek mythology that references Phanes by that name. The more popular accounts of Greek mythology, like Hesiod's Theogony, refer to him either as Protogonos or Eros, and his importance within the creation of the world is greatly diminished. Orphism is also the only Greek myth that uses the idea of a primordial god or the world hatching from an egg. So there's also that. It's like, the Orphic egg. That's a thing. Orphism, Orphic egg. Anyway. Anywho, my extremely paraphrased and very high level summary of the Orphic creation myth goes something like this. In the beginning, there only existed the goddess Chaos, whose name means abyss in Greek, incidentally, and from her came two serpentine gods, Kronos Ion, also known as time, and Ananke, also known as inevitability or fate. These two gods violently mingled together and begot the great silver cosmic egg, from which hatched the very first god of creation known as Phanes. Now, Phanes had a body made entirely of light. He also had wings, a helmet, and a serpent that coiled around him, and he took that serpent to be his symbol. Before Sun and Moon claims that Genshin's Phanes had wings and a crown, so that part checks out. Now, there are at least a dozen other primordial gods that came into being after Phanes, including Gaia, the earth, Thalassa, the sea, Uranus, the sky, etc., but the only one I really want to mention specifically in passing is Nyx, or night. See, Phanes was also considered a god of light, and sometimes was considered to be the creator of daytime. Nyx is in many ways his counterpart, being the goddess of night that often takes the form of a raven. But her relationship with Phanes is confusing because depending on the myth and the variation, she can be either his mother, sister, grandmother, or daughter, while also being his wife and consort. And that's how confusing the Orphic myths can be. Anywho, Nyx is important, but maybe not for this video, but make note of her anyway because she'll come up again, especially with the raven motif, especially if you remember this video here, where we talked about the raven insignia and how it's encircling a little glimmer of light in an eclipse and what that might actually mean in terms of Conria and Kaya and a bunch of other fun things. So if that sounds interesting, you should watch that. I will leave a link downstairs. But I digress. Nyx is important. We'll talk about her again, probably in another video, but not for right now, so just make a mental note and we'll move on. Now, my argument for Phanes and the Primordial One being two different entities comes from the fact that there is no variation of Orphic or Greek mythology where Phanes, or Eros, is the first god to appear. There is always at least two gods that precede him. This is partly why I think Phanes is a shade of the Primordial One and not the Primordial One itself. Also, the shades are described as shimmering, so I can't help but think of how Phanes is described as having a body made of light. I mean, that seems kinda shimmery, right? And obviously, Phanes was born from the world egg that was laid by time and fate. This is where you could argue that the Primordial One and Phanes are the same being, but I'm still going to argue against that because of one very small detail. To quote, "It had wings and a crown and was birthed from an egg, androgynous in nature." This line that references the Primordial One, supposedly, basically outright describes Phanes as per Orphic myth. However, this is the point where the two entities start to overlap as creation-based deities. In this case, I think it's more likely that the Primordial One created the egg that birthed Phanes, and not that the Primordial One hatched from the egg itself. The next line reads, "But for the world to be created, the egg's shell had to be broken." However, according to the order of events that we laid out in the previous section, by the point at which the egg was used to separate heaven and earth, the Primordial One had already done battle with the Vishops and forced them to submit. This is outlined in 40 Years After the Held Branches, which claims that the Primordial One only created heaven and earth after the Vishops were defeated. To do that, it needed to break the egg in order to use the shell to separate the heaven and the earth. Obviously, it's not a foolproof argument, but it makes more sense that the Primordial One created 4 shades, and one of them was actually the cosmic egg that Phanes hatched from. That would perfectly line up with the idea that the Primordial One and one of its shades, Phanes specifically since he's a god of creation, created life as we know it. They did it together. So that leaves us with 2 creator deities, the Primordial One and Phanes, and their ark-like egg that houses life and those problematic little things we call humans. So what about the other 3 shades? What was their purpose, and what the heck were they doing while the Primordial One and Phanes were off creating life? To answer that question, we have to take a little side trip. Before Enkanomiya was released, the only references of prehistoric times that we had all centered around one key concept: the Seelies and the 3 moons. And we have 3 remaining shades. How very convenient. At some point after Phanes, but before the fall of Enkanomiya, there were 3 moon sisters that took turns driving their sovereign carriage across the sky. If they failed to successfully change drivers, it was said that a great disaster would befall Teyvat. Or, well, technically the world, because they didn't actually use the word Teyvat, so we're just making some assumptions here. Interesting to note that the moons here are said to have a sovereign carriage, while the Primordial One was considered to be the sovereign of sovereigns. Phanes, the 4th shade, also had a body made entirely of light, and in some myths was the creator of daytime. You could say that gives him some solar associations. This is noteworthy because the Greek solar deity is known as Helios, who was known for driving his divine carriage across the sky as the embodiment of the sun. Now, in Enkanomiya, the Dainichi Mikoshi is also known as the Helios, as well as the chariot of the sun, and it requires a divine bridle to manipulate it. Remember this. Now, the Moon Sisters existed alongside a race known as the Seelies, who were supposed to guide humanity. Note that while we've seen the ghostly remains of the Seelies, we don't actually have any idea what they looked like. One notable event, however, was the marriage of a Seelie with a, quote, traveler from afar, which took place in the Lunar Palace. We know nothing of this traveler from afar, except that they were likely not a Seelie or a human, as those wouldn't have been considered as coming from a faraway place, since, it's kind of the same place. However, a traveler from afar could very well be connected to the so-called second who came. For you see, 30 days after the marriage of the Seelie and the traveler, a great disaster occurred. The two were supposedly separated for eternity and their memories were wiped, and then the Moon Sisters decided to turn on each other and they died or killed each other or something. And the remaining Seelies withered away soon after that, leaving behind their ghostly remains that lead us to treasure chests. Now, the traveler from afar bears some similarities to the second who came as illustrated in the Before Sun and Moon book. Both of them started some sort of disaster, although the second who came technically started a war, but I will consider a war a type of disaster. That checks out. And interestingly, you know how the Abyss Order was hunting down the book Before Sun and Moon? Well, if you remember back to the very beginning of the game, they were also hunting down another book that we recovered from them with the help of Lisa. It's called The Pale Princess and the Six Pygmies. We recovered volume 1 of 7, and MiHoYo still won't release the other 6 volumes from Lore Jail, so I can't really cover these series in depth, but I can point out a couple of interesting things based on the volume short descriptions because those are public knowledge. Basically, the Pale Princess meets a Light Prince from another country, region, let's call it, and on their journey they meet 6 pygmies who eventually do something horrible and everything gets really sad. A Light Prince, to me, sounds a lot like Phanes, if only because he was either a sovereign himself or the son of a sovereign, and his body was made of pure light, so that would make him a Light Prince. Interesting to note that a princess and a prince is the perfect setup for a fairy tale romance, not unlike our Seelie and Traveler from earlier, although that kind of does conflict with the idea that the Light Prince and Phanes are associated together, because Phanes should have come before the Light Prince and wouldn't have necessarily come from afar, but hey, we're dealing in conflicting theoreticals. Let's roll with it. We're just looking for similarities to put together some possible story that could happen later on. We're missing puzzle pieces, okay? We're taking guesses. Now, incidentally, the Pale Princess also lives in a place called the Moonlight Forest, which could be a reference to the Moon Sisters, maybe? And while the people there are considered very pale and beautiful, there are apparently a lot of horrifying monsters that live just outside the forest. Horrifying monsters lurking in the dark sounds a lot like the Vishops in Enkanomiya. Maybe a stretch or a reference, who knows? I'm just pointing it out. Is any of this relevant? I don't know, maybe, maybe not. I just think it's interesting to note the parallels between 2 very different books that the Abyss Order wants because they supposedly conceal a very important secret, and there are just so many parallels. It's weird, okay? But speaking of secrets, did you pick up on my subtle nods about the Moon Sisters being the other 3 shades of the Primordial One? Well, what if I told you Ishtaroth and Kairos might actually be one of them? That she fell into the sea along with Enkanomiya and survived. Yeah, you heard that right. Ishtaroth might actually be a moon. That means that the Moon Sisters are the remaining 3 shades of the Primordial One, which makes Phanes the sun brother, probably. and the Seelies could have been considered envoys of these primordial gods who walked benighted amongst humanity in order to guide them until one day a Seelie fell in love with some traveler from afar, which resulted in big disaster goes no, boom, boom. Yeah, that's a thing. But wait, I hear you say, Ishtaroth was the god of time. She can't be a moon sister. Well, hold on to your saddle, cowboy. This pony's gonna take you on a journey. I promise I'm going somewhere with this. So during one of the interviews with the Genshin developers, they stated that the artifact system was based off the suits in tarot cards. I know this feels like a really abrupt segue. I get it. Just bear with me. Most don't think much of this statement at first blush, but when you really sit down to think about it, saying that our 5-piece artifact system is based off of a 4-suit tarot system doesn't make a whole lot of sense now, does it? That's because there's an additional reference that they don't talk about. See, there were 4 shades of the Primordial One, plus the Primordial One. 4 suits, 4 shades, plus 1 for 5. Huh? You see where I'm going with this? No? Okay. Well, let me see if I can explain. So the suits in tarot are wands, pentacles, cups, and swords, which correlate to fire, earth, water, and air, respectively. We're going to match these to each type of artifact: flower, plume, sands, goblet, and crown. I know they're mismatched. Bear with me, because these results are totally going to blow your mind. Let's start with the flower. The flower, or flower of life, is the easiest artifact type to match. Wands are traditionally made of wood in the tarot and typically show flowers blooming off of little offshoot branches. Wands are also associated with the element of fire and generally represent creative energy, copulation, motivations, and, that kind of thing. Driving forces, motive forces, inertia. Seeing as fire gives off light and wands deal in matters of creation, this perfectly emulates the shade Phanes. He was the source of life, hence flower of life, and also flowers grow from seeds and seeds are just plant eggs. You're welcome for that mental image. Next up, we'll talk about the plume. The plume, or the plume of death, is represented by a feather. Feathers belong to birds, and birds are known for being conspicuously airborne. Additionally, I've pointed out in other videos linked downstairs that birds were very commonly seen as representative of the human soul. Human souls are associated with ghosts, and ghosts only come out when people are dead, so yeah, plume of death makes sense. Now, I liken this artifact type to the suit of swords. Swords represent thoughts, words, written records, and the element of air. That makes the artifact type representative of Ishtaroth. Now remember that Ishtaroth is hailed as the 1,000 winds of time, which works with the air element and the sword suit. Most of you are probably thinking that she'd work better as the sand since that's like a clock, right? And clocks are time, but actually the feather is more perfect for her. Ishtaroth appears to be the god of moments. She captures snapshots, and even the writer of Before Sun and Moon calls himself a scribe of Ishtaroth, meaning she's associated with written records, at least to some extent. She's also known for creating the phenomenon of the sin shades, and if you didn't know this, shades, in the context of Greek mythology, reference the after images of the dead, the ghostly entities that walk the river Styx, or just exist in the realm of Hades. In some ways, she might be remembering the moments from the lives of the deceased. Plume of Death therefore suits her quite well. Side note, if Venti is considered to be related to Ishtaroth in any way, shape, or form because he's the god of wind and he was worshipped along the god of wind in time with the Thousand Winds Temple and everything else that we have going on here, then it's interesting that he's a bard and that this suit is associated with written words and written records, because you could also point out that that is, like a song or a poetry sort of thing. It's just really fitting. Now, I don't have names for the remaining 2 shades, but I'd like to at least give some insight into what they could be and what they could do based on the tarot suits. Spoiler alert, they both also have to do with time. That means we have 3 time gods, not 1, and each rule over time in a different way. Or perhaps a different aspect of time would be a better way to think of it. Now let's look at the sands of Eon. First off, Eon is a massive span of time that can be broken down into eras. Scientists usually mark an eon as about 1 billion years. This is in contrast to Ishtaroth's moments, which seem to span only a few minutes. I'm going to associate the sands with the suit of pentacles. Pentacles deal with money and material possessions and is always associated with the element of earth. The sands artifact type is represented by an hourglass, which is filled with, well, sand, which is a type of earth. Yeah. Curiously, this isn't a clock in a traditional sense. A clock only goes in one direction forever and ever, but an hourglass passes the time within it back and forth as it's flipped over. It's fairly cyclical in that way. Again, in stark contrast to Ishtaroth's moments. And now we can look at the goblet of Eonotham. I admit I had to look up what Eonotham means. Turns out it's a really specific geologic term that refers to a particular span of time within a given eon, usually in the form of rock deposits. That makes it representative of like an era, basically. So now we have eons, eras, and moments. Big time, part time, small time. Or maybe past, present, and future, like the three fates in Greek mythology. Now, incidentally, the mother of Phanes is Ananke, and Ananke was also the mother of the Fates, since she was basically fate itself. Is that a coincidence? I don't think so. Well, anyway, goblets are just cups, so they are obviously the cup suit in tarot. And cups represent water and generally deal with emotions and emotionally sorts of thingies. Some of the best cards to get when asking a tarot reader questions about love come from the cup suit specifically. And finally, we're out of suits. We're also out of shades though, so that leaves the final artifact type, the Crown of Logos, to represent the Primordial One. Now, I also had to look up logos, because I didn't know what it meant, and apparently it refers to the Word of God, divine reason, and creative order. If that's not enough to convince you that this crown, suitable for a sovereign, represents the ultimate god, I don't know what is. Consider the Crown of Logos to be the dealer of the cards when it comes to the tarot. It's kind of fitting when you think of it that way. So the cool thing about these parallels here is it gives reason to why we have artifacts. We're basically calling on the primordial powers of the world. Something I think would be really interesting to do as a little side project is to go through artifact sets, and because we know that the stories they tell are out of order, I want to see if the flower is actually talking about origins and the sword is usually talking about like things that were spoken or said, and if the clocks represent things that have already occurred, like actual events, and if the goblets talk about the emotions of the characters that are in the artifact set. Again, this is not something that I have done, I'm just curious to see if they would go that far. So, how do we tie all this back to the moons, you ask? Well, this is a depiction of the god Dionysus leading the three Horae, also known as the Hours, which is a perfect parallel for Phanes leading the Shades. Why? Well, Phanes was not just the god of creation, he was also the god whose story centered on reincarnation. His first iteration was obviously Phanes, but he would die and then get later reborn as a god named Zagreus. Later, Zagreus would also die, and he would be reborn as none other than Dionysus, the god of wine. Again, Venti, you're looking really suspicious right now. Anyway, the Horae were the three goddesses that represented the passage of time in the form of seasons, spring, summer, and autumn, with winter notoriously absent. They were considered the guards of Mount Olympus, and you know what? The Moon Sisters take turns driving a carriage across the sky, almost like they're taking turns on guard duty. They also have another incarnation wherein they serve Zeus as the entities of justice, order, and peace. Kind of similar in concept to the heavenly principles, if you stop and think about it for a minute. Especially when it's said that eternity is the idea that's closest to the heavenly principles. And if the moons and the heavenly principles are related, and they are also gods of time, then eternity being related to them makes a whole lot more sense now, doesn't it? So conceptually, the Horae fit the primordial shades very, very well. And since the Horae govern over natural time through seasons, we can actually use science to connect the Horae back to the moons. You see, throughout of all human history, natural time is always calculated via the moon. See, a full moon cycle from full moon to full moon is about 29.5 solar days, which is why we have about 30 days every month. Or maybe I should say moonth. You divide that by 4 phases and you get roughly 7 days. That's 1 week. 12 lunar cycles, or moonths, makes for 354 days for a complete solar year. That's 11 days shy of our typical 365, which is the number we use for completely different reasons, which I will not get into right now. The point here is that natural time was always calculated by the moons. Therefore, it makes sense for the moons to be gods of time, to rule over time itself. Therefore, I believe that the moons may in fact also be all gods of time, but different parts of time, as illustrated by the tarot suits and the artifact sets. Feathers representing fleeting moments, sands representing eons, and cups representing eras, with Phanes representing the start of everything, the start of time, as a flower, birthed from seed. But I have to add a little bit of a footnote here. In the original Chinese text, there are some discrepancies in the words accompanying each artifact type. For example, the sands of eon are actually the sands of time. This is annoying because beyond the overt use of the word time, this artifact does not reflect Ishtaroth all that well, in my opinion. The cyclicality of an hourglass is still at odds with her theme of snapshotting moments and death, and feathers don't really fit the element of earth all that well when you're comparing it to the tarot, which is a developer-confirmed reference. Ultimately, this discrepancy in translation, for the sands anyway, doesn't really change anything for me, and the same can be kind of said for the crown, which is called logos in English but logic in CN, and logic as in reason. Logos and logic are two very different things, but I suppose if you wanted to make logic divine in some way, calling it logos kinda works, so that's fine too. And like I said, logic is a form of reasoning, and the idea of having the Primordial One associated with reason, well, Honkai fans probably already have an idea about where I'm going with this, but we can explore that in a completely separate video. Just want to acknowledge it here first. However, there is one translation that is completely different, and that translation is for the goblet. In the original Chinese text, the goblet of Enkanomiya is actually the goblet of space, which is very different from the geologic formations that mark eras within a given eon, and I find this choice of translation frustrating on many levels. But with that frustration comes one additional realization, which I guess we could consider a benefit. And that realization is that we've actually seen a shade of the Primordial One already. Well, most likely, if any of what I've presented here today is true. And that shade is Susti. You know, the sustainer of heavenly principles. I named her Susti in another video. She's basically distorting space with her cube power things. She's disassembling and reassembling, warping in and out of nowhere. Her powers of the void are just space-time distortion, which I guess can still kind of make her a god of time, just a god of space-time, which is still pretty different, but also kind of works, sorta. I know space-time isn't really time, but, you know, bending the rules, I guess. And if Susti here is, in fact, a shade of the Primordial One, then there's a damn good chance that she's also one of the Moon Sisters. And that lends some weight to my earlier suggestion that the 3 shades or Moon Sisters may have been guards or soldiers. Susti kind of fits that description since she's guarding Teyvat or Celestia. Wherever the heck this is, anyway, she's enforcing. That's kind of what soldiers do, right? Kind of, sort of. All I gotta do now is wait for the Hersher of the Void jokes. You cannot avoid those, especially now that they're basically confirmed. So, what have we learned today? Well, for starters, the Primordial One did not create the world, it merely found it and made adjustments to it for its own personal reasons. The native species of this world were the Vishops, which ruled over 7 nations which apparently predate human existence, which is weird. The Primordial One, along with 3 of its shades, defeated the native Vishops, then used its 4th shade, Phanes, to create new life forms including humans from the world egg. Seelies must have been created soon after this, for they were tasked with guiding early humans under the watchful eyes of the Moon Sisters, who could be 3 of the Primordial One's shades and also possibly rule over different aspects of time, which means that one of these Moon Sisters would be Ishtaroth, also known as Kairos. During this period, another entity known as the Second Throne came along and started a war that killed the Moon Sisters and the Seelies, and then also caused Enkanomiya to sink beneath the sea. And as a side note, the Primordial One and its shades are represented in our artifacts and draw inspiration from the tarot. And that's my preliminary take on the prehistory of Teyvat in light of the information presented in the book Before Sun and Moon. And now you probably all understand why I didn't want to wrap this into my very first video on Enkanomiya. There was a lot to get through. That said, I think this is enough content for one video. We can explore other theories that come from all of this information a little bit later, but I think we'll just leave things here for now. I just wanted to take a quick moment to thank you all for watching this video and being patient with me as I try to carve out some semblance of a reasonable schedule into the chaos that is my life. I appreciate you guys, I do. I also appreciate sleep, so I'm gonna go do that now because it is nap time. That pillow is calling my name. Hello, pillow.